The day Jeremiah Sutton walked into Dolly's diner in the small Colorado mountain town of Creede, he was not looking for trouble, and he was certainly not looking for love. But fate, as it so often does in the high country, had arranged things without consulting him first. It was the autumn of 1882, and the San Juan mountains had begun their slow retreat into gold and amber, the aspens trembling along the ridgelines like women shaking out their hair before a storm. Creede was a mining town that had not yet fully decided what it wanted to be, still rough around the edges, still carrying the particular smell of ambition and desperation that clung to every frontier settlement. The main street was a muddy corridor of saloons, a general store, a telegraph office, a livery stable, and at the far end Dolly's diner, which was neither fancy nor poor, but which served the best elk stew west of the Continental Divide. Jeremiah came down from the mountains every few weeks to resupply. He was a trapper and a guide, a man who had carved his living from the wilderness since the age of 18, and now at 32, he wore the evidence of that life across his body like a second skin. He stood just over 6 feet tall and was built with the kind of broad-shouldered, deep-chested solidity that made doorframes seem inadequate. His arms were thick with muscle from hauling traps and felling timber, and his hands were large, rough, scarred along the knuckles from 100 small battles with the terrain. He kept his dark brown hair longer than most men in town thought proper, curling against the back of his collar, and framing a face that was weathered and strong-jawed, with dark eyes that had the quality of a man who spent most of his time watching the world rather than talking about it. He wore a heavy canvas coat, tall leather boots, and a battered wide-brimmed hat that had survived more seasons than he cared to count. He smelled of pine resin and campfire smoke when he first walked in, and Dolly herself would wave him toward the washroom before she'd seat him, which he accepted with the mild good humor of a man who understood the social contract between civilization and the men who mostly ignored it. It was on his 4th visit of that autumn, a Tuesday in late October when the wind had begun to bite, and the first whisper of snow touched the higher peaks, that Jeremiah first truly noticed Myrtle Ford. He had seen her before, of course. Creede was not a large town, but he had not paid particular attention, the way a man does not pay attention to something that seems to belong to its setting, the way a hawk belongs to the sky. She had been part of the diner's landscape, a quiet woman, always at the same table near the window, always alone, always with a cup of coffee growing cold at her elbow while she pushed food around her plate more than she ate it. That Tuesday, Jeremiah took a seat at the counter and ordered his usual, a plate of stew and a wedge of cornbread, and while Dolly's daughter Clara fetched it for him, he watched Myrtle without meaning to. She was perhaps 28, he guessed, though sorrow had a way of making people look both younger and older at the same time, and it was hard to pin down. She was a handsome woman, not in the showy way of the saloon girls who sometimes pass through town, but in the quieter, more lasting way of a landscape you keep returning to. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pinned up at the back of her neck in the practical style of a working woman, though several strands had escaped and curved softly along her jaw. Her eyes, when she glanced up briefly at a noise outside, were a gray-green that reminded Jeremiah of a mountain lake just after rain. She was slight but not fragile, with the kind of posture that suggested she had once known great happiness and was still holding the memory of it in her spine, trying not to let it collapse. She was wearing black. She had been wearing black every time he had seen her in this diner. The quiet, unfussy black of a widow who has moved past the first screaming grief and settled into something harder and more permanent, the long gray country of absence. Dolly herself came to lean against the counter beside Jeremiah while he ate, dropping her voice in the way of a woman who considers gossip a form of civic duty. "Poor thing," Dolly said, with a nod toward Myrtle's table. "Been coming in here nearly every evening for going on 7 months, since Henry Ford passed." Jeremiah said nothing, but he listened, which Dolly correctly interpreted as permission to continue. "Influenza took him last March. Henry ran the assay office. Good man, honest man. Left her the house and a little money, but not enough to last forever, and she's been taking in mending and sewing to make ends work. Dolly lowered her voice further. I think she comes in here because she cannot stand to cook for one. You understand what I mean. The house is too quiet. Jeremiah understood. He had chosen his mountain life in part because the silence of the wilderness was a living silence, full of wind and animal sound and water running over stone. The silence of an empty house was a different animal entirely. He finished his stew, paid, and left without speaking to Myrtle Ford. But that night, up in his camp on the south-facing slope of a ridge above the Willow Creek drainage, he found himself thinking about gray-green eyes and a cup of coffee growing cold. He came back the following Tuesday. And the Tuesday after that. Each time she was at the same table, each time she ate alone. The other diners gave her polite, careful nods, the kind of social acknowledgement that honors grief while also keeping it at arm's length, because grief, like influenza, made people nervous. Children at the neighboring tables were occasionally hushed by their mothers if they laughed too loudly in Myrtle Ford's direction, as though joy were somehow offensive to sorrow, which it was, Jeremiah supposed, in a certain slant of light. He watched her and he thought. He was not a man who acted without thinking. The mountain had taught him patience the way it taught everything, through cold and hunger and the long consequences of reckless decisions. So he watched and he thought and he waited, and somewhere in the slow accumulation of those Tuesday evenings, he came to understand that what he was feeling was not pity. Pity was a distant thing. What he felt when he looked at Myrtle Ford was something closer, something that pulled in his chest like a fishing line going taut. He noticed the way she sometimes smiled faintly at the sound of children's voices before she caught herself. He noticed the careful way she folded her napkin, always into thirds, a small act of order in a life that had been disordered. He noticed that she always left a small portion of whatever she had ordered, as though she was not quite sure she deserved the whole of it. It was on a Thursday in November, when Jeremiah had come down from the mountains not for supplies, but simply because the loneliness of the high country had pressed particularly hard against him, that he made his decision. The diner was warm against the cold that had settled over Creede like a wool blanket, blue and heavy. Wood smoke curled from every chimney along the street, and the smell of it mixed with the smell of coming snow. Jeremiah stomped the mud from his boots at the door and scanned the room in the automatic way of a man trained by wilderness to read a space before entering it. Myrtle Ford was at her table. The chair across from her was empty. Every chair at her table was empty. Around her, the diner hummed with conversation, the clink of silverware, the laughter of a group of miners celebrating some small fortune at the far end of the room, the steady, warm noise of people in community with one another. And she sat in the middle of it like a stone in a stream, the current going around her, never through. Jeremiah had eaten his supper standing at the counter before she arrived, so his stomach was full, but that was not why he crossed the room. He crossed the room because 7 months was long enough for a person to eat alone, and because the chair across from Myrtle Ford was empty, and because somewhere in the last several weeks he had stopped being a man who simply observed the world and become a man who wanted to change at least one small part of it. He reached her table. He pulled out the chair across from her. The legs scraped softly against the plank floor, and he sat down. Myrtle Ford looked up from her plate, and her gray-green eyes widened with surprise that was not quite alarm, but was close enough to alarm that Jeremiah put his hat on the table between them as a kind of offering of harmlessness. "Evening," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking rarely but meaning it when he did. Myrtle stared at him for a moment. She glanced at the hat. She glanced at the door briefly as though calculating the distance, and then she looked back at him and he saw the surprise settle into something more measured, more considering. "Good evening," she said carefully. Her voice was soft but not weak, with a slight Missouri lilt that told him she had not always been a Colorado woman. "Jeremiah Sutton," he said, and he did not extend his hand across the table because his hands were large and rough and might startle her, so instead he simply gave her his name like a key, something she could take and examine at her own pace. "I know who you are," she said. "You trap up on the ridge above Willow Creek. Dolly has mentioned you." He almost smiled. Dolly mentioned everyone. It was her particular gift and her particular weakness. "Myrtle Ford," he said, not a question, an acknowledgement. "Yes," she said. A silence settled between them, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Jeremiah had made his peace with silence long ago, and Myrtle, he suspected, had had her fill of the aggressive kind of silence that an empty house provided. This silence was different. It had another person in it. "I noticed you've been eating alone," he said finally, with the directness of a man who saw no value in circling around a thing. Something moved across her face. Not offense. Not quite sadness. Something more complex and more human than either of those. The particular expression of a person who has been seen when they had believed themselves invisible. "I suppose I have been," she said. "Seemed like the chair was available," Jeremiah said. She looked at the hat on the table between them for a long moment, and then she looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, taking in the broad shoulders and the dark eyes and the length of hair at his collar and the particular quality of stillness he carried, and he held her gaze steady and let her look. "Well," she said at last, and the smallest possible edge of something almost like humor entered her voice, thin as the first ice on a November puddle but present, undeniably present. "I suppose it is." He stayed until she finished her supper. He ordered a cup of coffee because it gave his hands something to do. They did not talk very much that first evening. He asked her once if the mending work kept her busy, and she said it kept her hands busy, which was not quite the same thing. He told her once about a young elk he had watched for 3 days from a blind above the tree line, the way it had learned to test the wind before it stepped into any open space, and she listened with the focused attention of a woman who has been hungry for stories without knowing it. When she rose to leave and tied her coat, Jeremiah stood as well, because his mother had raised him correctly even if the mountains had roughened most of her teachings beyond recognition. He walked her to the diner door and held it open, and she stepped out into the cold night air of Creede, and he watched her walk the 2 blocks to her house on Cedar Street before he turned and went to find his own lodging at the boarding house on First. He lay on the narrow boarding house bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind push down from the peaks, and he thought about gray-green eyes and the way a woman could hold the memory of happiness in her spine. He came back the following Thursday. She was there. This time when he pulled out the chair across from her, she looked up with the same gray-green eyes, but they were not surprised. They were something else. Expectant perhaps in the most careful and guarded way that expectation could be expressed. "Mr. Sutton," she said. "Jeremiah," he said. "If it's all the same." She considered this. "Jeremiah," she said, and his name in her voice sounded like something he had not known was missing from it. That evening they talked more. She told him she was from Hannibal, Missouri, that she had come west with Henry in 1878 when the silver rumors pulled him like a tide. She said it without bitterness, which told him something about the quality of the love she had carried for Henry Ford. Henry had been a dreamer, she said, but the good kind, the kind that made the world seem larger rather than threatening. She missed him every single day, she said, with the straightforward honesty of a woman who has decided that pretending is too exhausting to maintain. Jeremiah told her about his own origins, which was unusual for him, but she had a quality of listening that made sharing feel less like exposure and more like exchange. He had grown up in Kentucky, he said, the 3rd son of a hardscrabble farmer, and had headed west at 18 because the land there was too small and too familiar, and he had needed to find the kind of country that could hold the size of what he felt without bending under it. "Did you find it?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "Up above 12,000 feet when the weather is clear and you can see 3 states, I found it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, almost to herself, "I think I have been looking for something like that too, Not the mountain, but that feeling. He did not press her on what she meant. He simply filed it away in the careful interior library where he kept things that mattered. Thursday became Tuesday and Thursday. Then it became every evening that Myrtle came to the diner, which was most evenings, because he had been right about the quiet house and the difficulty of cooking for one. And because, though neither of them said it plainly for a long while yet, the evenings had become the part of the day they both moved toward. Dolly watched all of this with unconcealed satisfaction. She began to ensure that Jeremiah's coffee was always fresh when he arrived, and that the table by the window, Myrtle's table, was never given to anyone else. She mentioned this management of affairs to her daughter Clara with great self-congratulation, as though she had engineered the whole thing, which she had not, but which she deserved some credit for in the ways that good environments deserve credit for the flowers that grow in them. By December, the mountains above Creede were locked in their winter severity, the passes closing one by one as the snow deepened, and Jeremiah had adjusted his trapping territory to stay closer to town. This was not something he had done before. He told himself it was practical, that the lower elevations held beaver and marten enough to fill his quota without risking the high country trails in heavy snow, and this was true, as far as it went. But the full truth, which he turned over privately like a stone in a cold stream, was that staying near town meant Thursday evenings at Dolly's diner and Myrtle Ford's voice telling him about the book she was reading, or the difficult pattern she had been asked to reproduce in taffeta silk for the sheriff's wife. She had begun to eat more. He noticed this without comment, because commenting on it would have embarrassed her and also would have required him to admit how closely he had been paying attention. But the portions she left on her plate grew smaller, and once, in the second week of December, she finished everything and then looked mildly surprised at the empty plate, as though it had accomplished this without her knowledge. He saw her expression and felt something warm move through his chest. One evening, a Friday in mid-December, Jeremiah arrived at the diner to find Myrtle already there, but not alone at her usual table. Two men he recognized vaguely as brothers named Cleet and Porter Aldrich, both of whom did some combination of mining and drinking and neither well, had pushed their way to her table and were speaking to her with the particular loud familiarity of men who have had 4 drinks and believe this makes them charming. Myrtle had her back very straight and her hands flat on the table and was speaking in a quiet, level tone that suggested she was managing the situation with dignity while also making absolutely no progress. Jeremiah crossed the room. He did not do it quickly, because quick movement made noise and noise made escalation. He did it with the steady, unhurried certainty of a man who has already determined the outcome of a situation and is simply covering the distance to it. He pulled out his chair at Myrtle's table and sat down, and looked at Cleet Aldrich with dark, level eyes, and did not say a single word. The silence he produced was of a different quality than the comfortable silence he shared with Myrtle. It was the silence of a very large, very still thing that is watching you, and Cleet Aldrich, who was mean but not stupid, felt it settle over him like a cold shadow. "Evening, Sutton," Cleet said, with the careful tone of a man revising his plans. "Evening," Jeremiah said, and looked at Cleet and then at Porter with the unhurried patience of a man who has all night and nothing particular to lose. The brothers exchanged a look, and then they excused themselves with the shuffling dignity of a strategic retreat and went back to their own table near the door. Jeremiah watched them go and then turned back to Myrtle and picked up his coffee cup as though nothing had happened. Myrtle was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude. It was something warmer and more startled, as though she had forgotten that the world contained men who would simply and quietly place themselves between her and the difficult parts of it. "Thank you," she said softly. "Did not need to be anything more than it was," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said with a gentleness that nonetheless carried an edge of something deliberate, "You do that, you know, make things smaller than they are, simpler." "Is that a criticism?" he asked. "No," she said. I think it might be the thing I like best about you." The words landed between them on the table like something precious and fragile, and they both looked at them. And Jeremiah felt the particular quality of his own heartbeat change in a way he had not anticipated. He said nothing in response, because sometimes a man who values silence understands that silence, at the right moment, is the loudest possible affirmation. Christmas came to Creede with a ferocity that the locals called normal and the newcomers called ungodly. Snow filled the main street to the level of the hitching posts, and icicles hung from every eave like silver teeth, and the temperature at night plunged to a depth that made the air itself seem brittle. But the town celebrated with the particular warmth of isolated communities. The church was full on Christmas Eve, and the Creede Hotel held a dinner that drew everyone who could find their way through the drifts. Jeremiah knocked on the door of the house on Cedar Street on Christmas Eve afternoon. He was carrying a bundle wrapped in brown paper that he had been working on for 2 weeks, up in his camp when the trapping was slow, and the days were short, and his hands needed something to do. Myrtle opened the door in a dark green dress, not the widow's black, and he felt his breath catch briefly at the sight of it, at the sight of her stepping out of that particular shadow even partially, even just for a holiday. "Jeremiah," she said, and she was clearly surprised, but it was a good surprise, the kind that brightens the eyes rather than widening them in alarm. "I brought you something," he said, and held out the bundle. She took it inside and unwrapped it at the kitchen table while he stood in the doorway, hat in hand, and she peeled back the brown paper to find a carved wooden box, not large, perhaps the size of 2 hands placed side by side. He had carved it from a piece of mountain cedar that he had found in a sheltered draw above 12,000 feet, and the wood had a grain in it like water, and the smell of it was clean and high and permanent. Along the lid he had carved a small running elk, and around the sides he had carved a border of aspen leaves, each one individual and slightly different from the next. Myrtle sat at the kitchen table with the box in her hands and did not speak for a long while. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way that was not grief, or not only grief, but something older and stranger and more alive than grief. "It is beautiful," she said. "I thought you could put things in it," he said practically, because sentiment delivered straight made him uncomfortable in the way that heights did not, but open admiration of his own feelings did. "I know what I will put in it," she said, which was cryptic enough that he did not ask, and which he thought about for a long time afterward. She had given him something as well, a pair of heavy wool gloves she had knitted herself, lined with a scrap of soft buckskin. They fit his large hands perfectly, which meant she had been paying attention to his hands, which was a thought he carried back through the snowy street to the boarding house with something close to wonder. The new year arrived, 1883, and with it a thaw that was temporary and a general feeling in Creede of something beginning. The mines were producing, and the town was growing, and new buildings were going up at the edge of the main street, and there was talk of a proper bank and possibly even a school. Jeremiah and Myrtle had settled into a pattern that was comfortable and charged in equal measure, like the air before a lightning strike, pleasant and warm, but carrying within it the awareness of something larger gathering. They had supper together most evenings. He had taken to walking her home, and she had taken to standing at her door for a few extra minutes after they arrived, as though reluctant to end the evening. They had discovered a shared love of reading and had begun, tentatively, to loan each other books, which was the frontier equivalent of a very serious exchange of confidences. But neither had spoken directly about the thing that lived between them, that warm and weightless thing that had built itself out of coffee cups and shared silences, and the particular quality of attention they paid to one another. In February, the thaw ended, and a blizzard came down from the high country with the sudden seriousness of a bank robbery, no warning and considerable consequences. It lasted 3 days, and when it was done the snow on the main street was chest-high on a short man, and the temperature was holding at 15 below. On the 4th day, when Jeremiah had helped dig out the stable and the general store and several other buildings that needed attention, he found himself at Myrtle's door. He told himself it was a welfare call. He told himself he would simply confirm that she had enough firewood and food, which were practical concerns and perfectly reasonable. He knocked. She opened the door, and the relief on her face when she saw him was immediate and unconcealed, a flash of it, raw and honest, before she smoothed it into the composed expression she usually wore. And in that fraction of a second of unguarded feeling, he saw something that settled the question he had been carrying all winter. "The house," he said, "is the woodpile enough?" "I have maybe 2 days' worth," she admitted. "The shed door drifted closed and I cannot shift it." "I will get it," he said. He spent an hour digging out her woodshed and transferring cord wood to the porch where she could reach it easily. And then he checked the water pipes, which had not frozen because she had been sensible enough to keep the kitchen stove going. And he checked the window sills and the door seals. She watched him move through her small house with the quiet efficiency of a man who understands structures and their vulnerabilities, and made him a cup of tea while he worked. And when he sat down at the kitchen table, she sat across from him, and the domesticity of it settled over them both like something they had been practicing for a long time. "Jeremiah," she said. He said and looked up from his tea. She looked at her own hands for a moment and then at him, and the gray-green eyes were doing the thing they occasionally did, the thing he had learned to wait for, the thing where they went very clear and deep, and she was about to say something true. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "I am always honest with you," he said. "Why do you come?" she said. "Every evening, every Thursday. Why did you pull up that chair in November?" She paused. "You could have sat anywhere in that diner." He set down his teacup. Outside, the wind pushed at the eaves of the small house on Cedar Street, and the fire in the kitchen stove spoke quietly to itself. "Because you were alone," he said, "and you should not have been. Not because there is anything wrong with being alone, but because you specifically, Myrtle Ford, should not have been, because I could see from across the room that you were the kind of person who makes every room better, and it was being wasted on an empty table." He paused, and his jaw tightened slightly with the effort of continuing past the comfortable boundary of practicality. "And because I wanted to sit with you." Myrtle looked at him across the table in the cold winter kitchen of her small house in Creede, Colorado, and the color that came into her cheeks was not from the fire. "I should tell you something," she said carefully. "I loved Henry. I want you to know that because it matters to me that you know it. He was a good man, and I miss him, and I will always miss him. But I am 27 years old, and the world is still here, and I am still in it. And I think," she stopped, and gathered herself with the visible effort of a person dismantling a carefully maintained defense, "I think I have been alive again since November, since you sat down across from me." Jeremiah reached across the kitchen table and covered her hand with his, gently, the way you'd cup your hands around a flame in the wind to keep it burning. She looked down at his hand over hers. Her fingers turned up slowly and took hold. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She looked up at him and smiled, and it was the first time he had seen her smile fully, without reservation or apology, and it rearranged his understanding of what beautiful meant. "Good," she said. The weeks that followed were the most vivid of Jeremiah Sutton's life, which was saying something for a man who had seen high-country sunrises and the migration of elk herds and all the other magnificent carelessness of the natural world. But this was different. This was the specific and irreducible vividity of another person, of learning the particular shape of someone's attention and generosity and humor and sorrow. They began spending time together beyond the diner. On mild afternoons, Jeremiah took her on short rides along the valley floor, lending her the gentle bay mare he had acquired in addition to his working horse, and she rode with more confidence than he had expected, sitting the horse with a straight-backed ease that said she had known horses before the grief had narrowed her world. She was delighted by the way the winter sun caught the snow crystals on the spruce branches and turned them to scattered diamonds. She told him this, and he looked at her face rather than the spruce trees, and did not mention that he was doing so. He brought her things from the mountains, not always grand things. Sometimes a piece of quartz the color of smoke, sometimes a handful of dried juniper berries, once a perfect raven's feather that had the quality, in certain lights, of being shot through with blue. She kept them, all of them. He knew this because once when he was in her kitchen, he saw the carved cedar box he had made for her sitting on the kitchen windowsill, and when she was not looking, he lifted the lid briefly and saw the stones and the feather and a small dried sprig of something he could not identify laid carefully inside. He closed the lid and set it back on the windowsill, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man whose most careful work has been received as he intended it. In March, when the first genuine hint of spring came staggering up from the lower valleys like a man who has been too long in the cold, Myrtle Ford did something that surprised him entirely. She had been working on a quilt, he knew, in the evenings after supper, a large thing that she spread across the table to show him one evening with the quiet pride of a craftsman. It was a star pattern, 8 pointed stars in deep red and blue and golden yellow against an ivory background, and the stitching was extraordinarily fine, each stitch placed with the precision of a woman for whom the hands are a primary means of making the world make sense. "That is something," Jeremiah said, because it was. "I started it last spring," she said. "Right after Henry passed, I thought it might help to have something to work on." He looked at her hands resting on the quilt. "Did it?" "Yes," she said. "And no, your hands keep moving but your mind still goes where it goes." She smoothed a corner of the quilt. "But I am glad I finished it. It feels like something completed, something I can put down." He understood what she was saying. It was not a small thing she was telling him. Spring arrived in its proper and beautiful way, the snow retreating up the mountainsides day by day, the creeks running high and loud with melt water, the first green pushing up through the mud at the valley edges, and Jeremiah found himself returning to the high country for longer stretches again as the passes opened, and the trapping territory became accessible. This was the shape of his life, and it was not going to change, and he had always known this about himself, that the mountains were not a phase but a nature. But he came back. Every week, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times, he came back to Creede, and Myrtle Ford looked up when he walked into Dolly's diner with an expression that was not nearly as contained as she probably believed it was. On a warm evening in April, they were walking along the creek bank east of town, where the willows were leafing out in a haze of pale green, and the air smelled of damp earth and new growth, and Myrtle stopped beside a large, flat-topped boulder and sat down on it with the easy unself-consciousness of a woman who has begun to reclaim the habit of comfort. Jeremiah sat beside her. Their shoulders were close but not touching in the particular charged geography of two people who have not yet crossed a physical distance but are entirely aware of it. "Can I tell you what I'm afraid of?" Myrtle said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment, listening to the creek. "I'm afraid of loving someone and then losing them again, of being left alone again in a house that is too quiet." She paused. "Not because I am not brave enough, but because I know now what it costs." Jeremiah was quiet too. He could hear the creak and the wind in the willows and the distant hammer of a woodpecker somewhere in the dead spruce above them. "I know what I am," he said at last. "I am a man who spends most of his life at high altitude with poor company and no conversation worth mentioning. I am not the kind of man most women would choose." He turned to look at her. "But I have never in my life meant anything more than what I am going to say right now, and that is that you are not something I walked past, Myrtle. You are not something I almost paid attention to. You are the first thing in a long while that made me want to stay somewhere." She was looking at him with those clear, gray-green eyes, and the color was in her cheeks again, and the late afternoon light was doing something unreasonable to her hair. "I'm not going to promise you that nothing bad will ever happen," he said, "because the world does not work that way and you know it as well as I do. But I can promise you that I am the steadiest thing I know how to be, and that I will be here, and that I will always pull up a chair." Myrtle Ford laughed, which was unexpected and delightful, a real laugh, full and warm at his reference to November and the diner, and then she leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief and soft and entirely certain, the way small decisive acts are in the presence of very large decisions, and when she drew back they were both very still for a moment, like the moment after the first snowflake falls when the sky is still deciding what it means. "All right, Jeremiah Sutton," she said, with the gray-green eyes warm and alive and more present than he had ever seen them. "Stay then." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against his shoulder, and they sat on the flat-topped boulder by the creek in the April evening, while the willows shimmered green and the water ran fast and cold over the rounded stones below, and the San Juan mountains stood all around them in the gold of the late light, enormous and patient and entirely indifferent to human happiness in the way that all truly enduring things are indifferent, which is to say that their indifference was itself a kind of permanence, a kind of promise. Through May and into June, Creede hummed with the energy of a town finding its stride. New arrivals came through regularly, prospectors and merchants and a few families who had decided that whatever was being built in this mountain valley was worth building a life beside. A new schoolhouse was framed up at the north end of town, which delighted some and irritated others in the way that evidence of civilization always divided the people of frontier communities, those who wanted the frontier tamed, and those who had come specifically for its lack of taming. Jeremiah had a small property, 10 acres of it, on the south-facing slope where a spring ran clear all year, and the soil in the lower meadow was dark and workable. He had never done much with it. He had built a solid cabin of pine logs some years back, with a good stone fireplace and a tight roof, and he kept the firewood stacked and the well-maintained, but beyond that he had not bothered with it much because he had not had reason to. He began to have reason to. He spent 3 weeks in June working on the cabin. He extended the front porch by 6 feet and added a rail that was smooth enough not to snag a dress. He fitted new glass panes in the windows on the south side, where the light came strong and warm in the mornings. He dug out the root cellar and reinforced the walls and added shelving along both sides. He put in a second stove in the main room for warmth in the mountain winters, and he built a long work table along the eastern wall of the main room with good light, where a person might do fine needlework without straining their eyes. He did not tell Myrtle what he was doing until it was done. He brought her out to the property on a Saturday morning in late June, riding side by side up the trail from town to the south-facing slope, and the San Juan mountains were enormous and blue and white above them, and the air was the clean, bright air of high summer, and he watched her face as the cabin came into view through the pines. She stopped her mare at the edge of the clearing. The cabin sat solid and squared in the morning sun, the new porch boards pale and fragrant, the windows catching light. The meadow below it was green, and the spring came down through the rocks behind the cabin and crossed the lower meadow in a bright line. "Jeremiah," she said, "I know it is not the house on Cedar Street," he said, "and I know it is further from town and the winters are harder up here and the road in March is not always easy." He kept his voice level, but she had learned to hear underneath his levelness by now. "But it has good light, and it has the mountains, and it has room." She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were doing the clear, deep thing. "I have not asked you anything yet," he said. "I know you haven't," she said. He dismounted and came to stand beside her horse, and she looked down at him from the saddle, and he looked up at her, and the morning was still and warm, and the meadow smelled of grass and sun-warmed pine. "Myrtle," he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to take whatever time you need to answer it. You do not owe me a quick answer. You do not owe me any particular answer." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She was quiet for a long moment, and he let her be quiet, because he was a man who understood that the most important answers could not be rushed. Then she said, "I told you in November that I was not sure the world held that feeling anymore, the feeling of something large enough." "You did," he said. "I was wrong," she said. "Jeremiah Sutton, yes, I will marry you." He reached up and she put her hand in his, and he helped her down from the mare. and when she was standing in front of him, he cupped her face in both his large, rough hands with the gentleness of someone handling a thing of extraordinary value, and he kissed her in the morning light of the clearing, while the mountains watched and the spring ran cool over the stones below, and a hawk turned slow circles in the deep blue sky above them. They were married in August on a Saturday in the small church at the east end of Creede's Main Street, which was full to the door and slightly beyond it. Dolly closed the diner for the afternoon and attended in her best dress, which was a remarkable gray silk she had brought from St. Louis, and which she reserved for occasions that justified its existence. Clara stood with a handkerchief and was not ashamed to use it. Half the town came, because the whole town had been watching this story unfold since November and felt a collective proprietary investment in its outcome. Myrtle wore a dress she had made herself, which was expected of no one but which was the most beautiful garment anyone in Creede had seen in recent memory. It was a deep cream color, not white, because she had made it practical enough to wear again, and it was fitted through the bodice and full in the skirt, and along the collar and cuffs she had done her finest needlework in small flowers that no one could fully see unless they were very close, but which she knew were there, and that was the point. Jeremiah wore his best clothes, which was to say he had acquired a dark suit jacket from the dry goods store, and wore it over a white shirt with his dark trousers and his cleanest boots, and he had trimmed his hair but not cut it short, because Myrtle had told him specifically that she preferred it as it was, a statement that had pleased him more than he had let on. He stood at the front of the church waiting for her, and he was, by any objective measure, an impressive figure, the breadth of his shoulders filling the jacket completely, the quiet intensity of his attention filling the room just as completely. When Myrtle walked in on the arm of old Ben Calvert, who ran the assay office now and who had been Henry Ford's closest friend, and had agreed to stand in this role with a mixture of sadness and gladness that was visible in his face throughout the ceremony, the church went very quiet in the particular way that beauty creates quiet. Jeremiah watched her come down the aisle, and his expression, which was ordinarily composed and careful, became something that several women in the congregation would later describe in their own private accounts of the day as the most openly loving thing they had ever seen on a man's face, which surprised them because Jeremiah Sutton was not a man they had associated with open love, but which surprised him not at all, because he had stopped trying to contain what he felt for Myrtle Ford some time ago, and had found that the not containing of it was the single most natural thing he had ever done. They spoke their vows in the clear, simple language of the 1880s frontier church, and when the minister told Jeremiah he could kiss his bride, he took her hands and kissed her in front of the whole town, and the whole town responded with the specific combination of applause and sentiment that such moments produce. Dolly served pie afterward, 3 kinds. It was excessive and perfect. They moved into the cabin on the south-facing slope in late August, and the first weeks of it were the education of 2 people learning the specific grammar of sharing a space, the particular syntax of another person's morning habits and nighttime quiet, and the daily negotiation of needs and preferences, and the small adjustments that love makes automatically, the unconscious courtesy of people who genuinely want the other person to be comfortable. Myrtle made the cabin beautiful in the careful way she had of doing things, not extravagantly but specifically, with attention. The quilt she had made went on the bed. She planted a kitchen garden in the lower meadow before the season was fully over, getting in the hardier things, turnips and kale and garlic, that could manage the altitude and the early cold. She hung dried herbs from the kitchen rafters, and they swayed gently in the air from the stove, and the whole cabin smelled warm and clean and alive. Jeremiah built her a proper sewing cabinet in the workshop corner he had added to the back of the barn, with drawers for her threads and needles and notions, and a fold-out surface that was smooth and level. He built it without saying he was doing it, and presented it on a Tuesday morning with the straightforward manner of a man who considers love to be most accurately expressed through the construction of useful things. She stood before it with her hands pressed together in front of her, and then she turned around and put her arms around his waist, which required some upward reaching given the difference in their heights, and held on, and he wrapped his arms around her and held on back. "You impossible man," she said, into his chest. "Something wrong with the drawers," he said. She laughed and squeezed him harder, and he pressed his lips to the top of her head. The fall came on in its usual gorgeous violence, the aspens turning on the ridges above them in great sweeps of gold, and Jeremiah took Myrtle up above the tree line for the first time in late September, a day when the air was cold and clear, and the view from the south-facing ridge was the kind of view that makes a person understand why some people believed in God without any further argument required. She stood on the ridge in the thin, brilliant air and turned slowly in a full circle, looking at the ranges folding away in every direction, the snowfields and the bare gray rock and the sky so blue at altitude that it seemed to be another substance entirely, not air but some denser, more essential element. "Oh," she said, "just that. Oh." Jeremiah stood beside her with his hands in his coat pockets and watched her face and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has given someone a gift that could not be wrapped. "This is what you were looking for," she said, not as a question. "Yes," he said. She took his arm and leaned against him and looked out at the three-state view, and after a moment said, quietly, "I think it was what I was looking for too." Winter came back to the mountains with the seriousness it always carried at elevation, and the cabin proved itself exactly as solid as Jeremiah had built it to be. The snowfall above town was heavier than in Creede itself, and the mornings required both of them to move with the deliberate intention of people who understand that a cold stove at altitude is an emergency, not an inconvenience. But the cabin was warm when the fires were going, and there was a great satisfaction in that warmth, the earned warmth of good structure and sufficient firewood. And in the evenings when the storm was outside and the stove spoke, and the lamp made a small golden circle of light, Myrtle would work on her needlework or read, and Jeremiah would mend tack or clean his rifles or read himself, and the two of them occupied the same warm silence as naturally as two rivers joining, with no drama and no difficulty, and the particular peace of people who have found the right country to stop in. In February of 1884, Myrtle told him she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday morning over coffee, with the matter-of-fact directness she brought to important things, and then she watched his face the way she had learned to watch it, through the composed surface to the genuine country underneath. What she saw there was something she would hold in the cedar box of her heart for the rest of her life. His face went very still for a moment, and then something broke through it, not dramatically, not with tears or exclamation, but in the way that light breaks through clouds over high country, complete and golden and impossible to contain. "Are you certain?" he said. "Very certain," she said. He came around the table and took her face in both hands and looked at her with the full force of those dark eyes and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said, smiling. "Better than well." He sat back down and put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then looked back up at her, and she could see him rebuilding himself around a new interior architecture, a man rearranging everything to accommodate something larger and more fundamental than himself. "All right," he said. "All right. Then we need to make sure we have everything." He began to enumerate practical matters which she had expected and which delighted her, because she had understood for some time that practical matters were his love language, and she found it not cold but tender. She reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. "Jeremiah," he stopped. "I am happy," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her with those dark eyes and the gold still in them from what had broken through and said, "More than I have words for." "You have enough words," she said. "You always have exactly enough." The pregnancy proceeded through the spring and summer with the good health and straightforward difficulty that such things involved on the frontier. Myrtle was robust about it in the way she was robust about everything, with a practical acceptance of discomfort and a genuine wonder at the process. And she continued her needlework commissions until quite late in the season, because idle hands made her mind restless. Jeremiah adjusted his trapping range to ensure he was never more than a day's ride from home. He made an arrangement with a neighboring family, the Harpers, who had settled a quarter-mile down the slope, that Clara Harper would come to check on Myrtle on the days he was out working the lower country. He also had a long, careful conversation with Doc Pearson in Creede, and made sure he knew exactly when to come and how quickly he could be summoned. He did all of this without making Myrtle feel managed, which was the art of it, and she appreciated the art because she had noticed what he was doing and why. And the why of it, the particular quality of his vigilance, was the expression of something too large and sincere to be called merely protective, though protective was certainly part of it. Their son was born in October of 1884, on a night when the aspens had already given up their gold, and the first real cold had settled into the valley. Doc Pearson came up from Creede and Clara Harper came from next door, and Jeremiah was not allowed in the room during the birth, which he accepted with the controlled composure of a man who is handling his anxiety through the medium of extremely thorough firewood stacking. The child announced himself with a cry that was surprisingly authoritative for a person so new to the enterprise of existing, and when Doc Pearson allowed Jeremiah into the room, and he crossed to the bed where Myrtle lay flushed and tired and triumphant, and looked down at the small, angry face of his son, he made a sound low in his throat that was not a word in any language but was entirely clear in its meaning. "He looks furious," Jeremiah said. "He looks healthy," Myrtle said, with the serene certainty of a woman who has just accomplished something significant and knows it. "Hold him." Jeremiah held his son, both large hands supporting the small compact weight of him, and the child stopped crying and opened his eyes, which were the unfocused blue of all very new human eyes, and looked up at his father with the absolute and total helplessness of the newly arrived. And Jeremiah Sutton, who had faced blizzards and mountain lions and the Aldrich brothers without perceptible emotion, felt something in his chest that he could only describe, privately and much later, as the ground shifting permanently. They named him Henry Thomas Sutton, the Henry for Henry Ford, which was Myrtle's suggestion and which Jeremiah accepted immediately because he understood what it meant and respected it entirely. The Thomas for Jeremiah's own father, who had been a hard man but an honest one. Henry Thomas Sutton, who within a week had made the cabin so thoroughly his that it seemed impossible it had ever belonged to a quieter arrangement. Life on the south-facing slope above Creede organized itself around the baby, with the efficiency that necessity demands. Myrtle fed and soothed and kept the infant alive with the competent tenderness of a woman who had always known she wanted children but had feared, in the long gray months after Henry Ford's death, that the chance had passed. Jeremiah walked the colicky nights without complaint, carrying his son on a shoulder broad enough to be a good platform, pacing the main room while the stove ticked, and the night pressed against the cabin walls, and Henry Thomas gradually settled into the particular warm limpness of an infant who has finally run out of grievances. "You are a natural at this," Myrtle told him one morning when he had settled Henry into the cradle he had made and come back to the kitchen table looking satisfied. "He just needs moving," Jeremiah said, "same as anything that cannot settle on its own." "Jeremiah Sutton," she said, "you just described fatherhood as livestock management." He considered this. "Is that wrong?" "It is not entirely wrong," she admitted, and laughed, which woke the baby, which meant Jeremiah had to pick him up and begin moving again, which he did with a complete absence of resentment. The years accumulated like snowfall, each one adding depth and weight, and the changed quality of terrain that comes with accumulation. Henry Thomas grew from an infant of opinions to a toddler of considerable determination, to a small boy who had his mother's gray-green eyes and his father's constitution, which meant he was built like a small draft horse and had the climbing instincts of a mountain goat, and gave both his parents a continuous education in the specific terror and pride of raising a child in country that was genuinely dangerous. He followed Jeremiah everywhere that was safe to follow him and some places that were not, and Jeremiah taught him about the land with the same patient attention he had always brought to his understanding of it: how to read weather in the shape of clouds, how to tell a trail from a false trail, how to move quietly in the woods, which trees were which and what they needed, how to fish the cold streams and which pools to leave alone to replenish. Myrtle taught him to read from a slate board at the kitchen table, and to do his sums, and to behave with the basic decency she considered non-negotiable regardless of how remote they lived. And when the schoolhouse in Creede began its proper operation, she wrote him down 3 days a week through the spring and fall, and he regarded this as a mixed blessing, which was the appropriate response of a boy who prefers mountains to arithmetic. In the spring of 1887, Myrtle told Jeremiah she was expecting again. This time she told him in the same Sunday morning way over coffee, and this time his face did the same thing but faster, the light breaking through clouds, because he had been waiting for this news with a hope he had tried to hold lightly and had not entirely succeeded. 2, he said. 2, she confirmed. He got up and came around the table, and she stood and he held her cheek against his chest and his arms around her. And little Henry, who was 3.5 and had come in from wherever he had been, and was regarding his parents with the puzzled interest of a child who does not yet understand embrace as communication, said, "Papa, why are you squeezing Mama?" Jeremiah looked down at his son over Myrtle's head. "Because I am happy," he said. Henry considered this with the philosophical weight of a 3-year-old. "Are you happy because of breakfast?" "Not entirely," Jeremiah said. Henry said, and went back to whatever occupied him, apparently satisfied. Their daughter was born in December of 1887, on a day when the snow was gentle, and the light on it through the south-facing windows was the color of warm honey, and she was named Louisa Jane Sutton. The Louisa for no particular reason, except that it suited her from the moment Myrtle saw her face, and the Jane for Myrtle's mother, who had died some years before, and whose gentleness Myrtle had been carrying in her own hands without knowing where it came from until she looked at her daughter and understood. Louisa Jane was from her first hour a person of decided personality, not loud about it, but utterly certain, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular quality of stillness that concealed a great deal of interior movement. She was the kind of child who watched everything and said less than she understood, which her father recognized and her mother recognized, and which Henry Thomas did not recognize at all, being constitutionally inclined toward the direct approach. The cabin expanded again. Jeremiah added a proper second room for the children, built solidly against the existing structure. With 2 bunks he made himself and a small window on the east side that got the morning light, because children should have morning light, he thought, and because Myrtle had said something similar about the way light began a day, and he had never forgotten anything she said. The town of Creede grew through the late 1880s, and the mining boomed and the population swelled, and the school was soon full, and there was talk of a proper hotel and a library, which delighted Myrtle intensely, and which Jeremiah found less delightful than his wife, but more acceptable than he would have predicted when he was a younger man with simpler needs. Dolly's diner became something of an institution, and Dolly herself was something of an institution within it, and she continued to take a proprietorial interest in Myrtle and Jeremiah's life that was excessive and entirely benign. She brought them things: food when the baby was new, advice they did not ask for and sometimes needed, news from town that was sometimes interesting and sometimes simply Dolly, and the knowledge that someone was paying close attention to whether they were thriving. On the 7th anniversary of the evening, Jeremiah had pulled out the chair across from Myrtle in the diner, which was in November, He brought her back to Dolly's for supper. Just the two of them, Henry Thomas and Louisa, left with Clara Harper, who had become a fixture in their lives in the way that good neighbors become indispensable. The diner was warm and crowded in the November way it always was, and Dolly, who had been forewarned, had kept the table by the window clear, and she showed them to it with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has never fully stopped believing the whole thing was her doing. Jeremiah pulled out the chair across from Myrtle and held it while she sat, and then he walked around and sat across from her, and the table between them was the same table, and the window beside them showed the same street in the same November dark, and the smells of wood smoke and good food and community were exactly as they had always been. Myrtle looked at him across the table, and her gray-green eyes were warm and deep and entirely present, the eyes of a woman who is not eating alone, who has not been eating alone for 7 years, who does not eat alone anymore. "You pulled up a chair," she said. "I did," he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the same gesture she had made in her kitchen in February of 1883, and his large, rough hand turned up and held hers, the same way it always had. "Best thing you ever did," she said. "Second best," he said. She tilted her head. "What was first?" He looked at her with those dark eyes, steady and warm and entirely certain. "Staying." Dolly arrived with their coffee at precisely this moment, which was either excellent timing or the result of Dolly watching the table with more than casual attention, and she set down the cups and looked at them both with an expression of such intense satisfaction that it was nearly a physical presence at the table, and then she went back to the counter and said, loudly enough to be heard by anyone nearby, "That is what it looks like, Clara. You take note." Clara took note. Jeremiah and Myrtle drank their coffee in the warm diner in November in Creede, Colorado, in 1889, and talked about the children and the cabin and the spring planting and a book Myrtle was reading, and a particular ridge where Jeremiah had found sign of a very large cat, and whether they needed to replace the shingles on the woodshed roof before winter fully arrived. And all of it was ordinary, and all of it was extraordinary in the way that an ordinary life, shared with the right person, becomes something that would have been impossible to imagine from the outside of it, from the vantage point of an empty table. They rode home in the clear, cold November night, side by side on the trail up the south-facing slope, and the stars above the San Juan mountains were the kind of stars you only see at altitude, massive and indiscriminate in their brightness, more light than dark in the sky when you really looked. Myrtle tipped her head back and looked up at them, her breath making small ghosts in the cold air. "Do you ever think about where you would be if you hadn't walked into the diner that night?" she said. Jeremiah considered this with his usual unhurried seriousness. "No," he said, "I stopped thinking about that a long time ago." "Why?" she said. "Because wherever I would have been," he said, looking at her profile against the star-bright sky, "it would have been without you. And that is not a life I can spend any time imagining." She looked at him, and the starlight was in her eyes and the cold had put color in her cheeks, and she was more beautiful to him at this moment than she had been the morning in the clearing when he had asked her, which had been more beautiful than the evening in the diner when she had first looked at him with the beginning of trust, which had been more beautiful than every moment before. He had discovered this about love, that it had no ceiling, that the more you accumulated of it the more there was available, which was contrary to his experience of most other things, and which he had come to consider one of the genuine mysteries of the human situation. "You are a poet, Jeremiah Sutton," Myrtle said. "You just hide it very well." "I am a trapper," he said. "You are both," she said. They rode on up the slope in the dark, and the cabin came into view with its lit windows making warm squares of gold in the darkness, the particular gold of a lit window on a cold night that means home, that means people inside who are yours and whom you are. And Jeremiah Sutton looked at those windows and felt, as he felt every time he saw them from a distance, the specific and settled happiness of a man who knows exactly where he is going. He helped Myrtle down from her horse in the yard, and she stood for a moment with her hands on his arms, his large hands at her waist in the cold and the starlight. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. "For seeing me," she said. When I had stopped seeing myself. He held her face in his hands, the way he had when they stood in the clearing in the June morning of 1883, with the same gentleness and the same absolute certainty. "You were never invisible," he said. "Not to me, not for a single day." He kissed her in the cold yard under the San Juan stars while the horses stood patient in the dark. And then they went inside together, into the warm and lit interior of the life they had built. And Jeremiah put more wood on the fire and Myrtle checked on the children, who were asleep in the east-facing room with the morning light window. Henry Thomas sprawled in the democratic way of a boy who believes he owns his bed entirely, and Louisa curled with the precise intentionality of a girl who has already decided exactly how she wants things to be. Myrtle came back to the main room and sat beside Jeremiah on the bench in front of the fire, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side. And the fire talked to itself, and the wind spoke in the aspens outside, and the mountains were enormous and dark and full of sky above the cabin, and everything was exactly as it should be, which was not nothing, which was not ordinary in any way that mattered, which was, in fact, the whole of what either of them had ever needed, and the whole of what they had found, in the most unlikely and necessary way, when a man walked into a diner and saw a woman eating alone and simply pulled up a chair. The years continued their good work. Creede grew, and the school grew with it, and Henry Thomas proved, to no one who knew him very well, to have the same feel for the land as his father, choosing to spend his summers on the mountain rather than in town as he grew into a rangy, capable boy who could track a deer through dry ground, and who understood whether the way some people understood language, intuitively and precisely. He was never as quiet as his father, being Myrtle's son also, and had inherited her humor along with Jeremiah's constitution, which made him the kind of young man that people enjoyed being around without entirely understanding why. Louisa Jane grew into the person her first hour had promised, deliberate and perceptive, and with a quality of intelligence that operated at a slight remove from the ordinary, the kind that sees patterns in things before the pattern has fully emerged. She loved her father's mountains with the same love but a different eye, more interested in the plants and the geology than the tracking, and she had filled 2 notebooks with careful observations and pressed specimens by the time she was 10, which Myrtle found without surprise and Jeremiah found with the particular pride of a man whose daughter has found something of her own. In the spring of 1891, Myrtle and Jeremiah sat on the front porch of the expanded cabin in the April evening, watching the last light leave the peaks above them, turning the snow from gold to rose to the cool blue-gray of dusk, and the San Juan mountains did what they always did in this light, which was to make you feel simultaneously very small and entirely sufficient. Myrtle had a cup of tea. Jeremiah had coffee. These were not negotiable aspects of their evening ritual and had not been for years. "I was thinking," Myrtle said, "about what I was like before November of 1882. Jeremiah looked at her. "I was so quiet," she said, "not shy, just very far away from myself." She turned her cup in her hands. "Grief does that, but even before the grief had finished, I was starting to think that was simply who I was going to be from then on." "And?" he said. She looked at him, and the dusk light was kind to her face, and she was 36 years old and more fully herself than she had been at any prior age, which was the particular gift of a life that had given her both loss and finding, both the long winter and the spring that followed it. "And then a large, stubborn man in a canvas coat sat down across from me without asking," she said, with the warmth in her voice that was also a kind of teasing, the particular warmth that comes from knowing someone well enough to make gentle fun of the things you love about them. Jeremiah smiled, the slow and genuine smile that she had been collecting for 9 years. "I asked," he said. "You did not ask," she said. You pulled up the chair and sat down. I said good evening, he said. That is not the same as asking, she said. No, he admitted, it is not. He looked out at the mountains in their blue-gray evening. I was not sure asking was the right approach with you. Why not? Because you would have said no, he said simply, and you would have meant it, but you would have been wrong. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, yes, I think I would have been wrong. They sat on the porch as the evening completed itself, and the stars came out above the mountains one by one. And inside the cabin, Henry, Thomas, and Louisa were arguing amiably about something that involved raised voices but no real heat. The ambient noise of children who are comfortable enough to disagree freely. And the woodpile was stacked high against the porch wall, and the spring still ran clear behind the cabin over the same stones it had always run over. And the horses were quiet in the small stable Jeremiah had built 8 years ago, and everything was present and accounted for and whole. Jeremiah, Myrtle said. He said, thank you for being stubborn, she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had been taking her hand since February of 1883, with the ease of 9 years of repetition and the unchanged significance of the very first time. Any time, he said. And he meant it in every way a man can mean the simplest words, as history and present and future, as the entirety of what he intended toward her, and toward the life they had assembled together piece by piece from the raw material of 2 separate solitudes, on the south-facing slope above Creede, Colorado, under the enormous enduring presence of the San Juan Mountains, in the country where he had gone looking for something large enough to hold what he felt, and had found in the end. That the largest thing was not the view from 12,000 feet, but the gray-green eyes of a woman who had been eating alone, and the simple, stubbornly hopeful act of pulling up a chair.